One. Hi, everybody. Today I have Michael Alexander, and I have known Michael for a long time, and I believe really wholeheartedly in the work that he does. He's right now representing Dr. Trozy, and I brought him on. He can tell us about the cases that he's working on today. And then he and I are going to look at not only the Bill 293, which is an SOS to all Canadians, but also some behind the scenes stuff that I've been researching on that I think Michael thinks is quite important and may explain a few things. So, Michael, did you want to just tell us a little bit more about yourself? Because I can't do you justice.
Um, well, I'm a lawyer based in Toronto. I was trained in Canada and the US, so I bring both of those perspectives to bear on my cases here in Canada. And for the past 3 years, I've been representing doctors and other healthcare professionals across Canada who have been harassed and prosecuted by regulatory colleges and by governments simply because they expressed an alternative or dissenting point of view about COVID-19 science and public policies. So all of these people, I mean, they found very technical grounds to go after my clients. But the primary concern they have is that these people have been spreading misinformation. So they are guilty of the crime of spreading misinformation. And so I've been walking these cases through regulatory tribunals in order to get at least one doctor into the court system on an appeal. And there's been a big change in our administrative law in Canada, which governs these situations when you want the court to review the decision of an administrative tribunal. And in 2019, the Supreme Court, in a case called Vavilov, said that the normal standard of review, which is something called reasonableness, where a lot of deference is shown by the courts to the an administrative body's interpretation of its own statute, that standard of reasonableness will no longer apply in the case where the home legislation or the enabling statute of an administrative body contains explicitly a statutory right of appeal. So in that case, then somebody who wants to appeal a tribunal decision can take it into the court system on the standard of correctness, which is the Supreme Court's own standard for reviewing a case. So that's where Dr. Trozy is right now. He's the only health professional in the country who, over this 3-year period, will go into the court system or has the opportunity to go into the court system on this higher standard of correctness. I've litigated a number of other cases, as have other lawyers. They've all been on the lower standard of reasonableness, where we are losing. I don't think we should have lost some of those cases, but there is a bias in favor of government on these COVID issues. On the standard of correctness, things are very different. And this is part of a 3-year strategy that I've been working on to get at least one professional into the system on this higher standard. So the day is finally here. And on October the 8th, Dr. Trozy, whose license was revoked by the College of Physicians in January for this crime of spreading misinformation, will go to the court and say, look, the college has made 5 very clear material errors of a law. If you decide in my favor on this high standard of correctness that the college got the wrong answer on any one of these issues, I get my license back and the college will have to do business in a different way in the future. So there's a lot at stake here because this includes a somewhat novel argument about the meaning of freedom of expression under the charter. And if our arguments are accepted on the charter issue, that will have a ripple effect across the entire country. But even on the basic administrative law issues that go to the legitimate reach of administrative bodies, if we went on that, that could also have a ripple effect because we are asking the courts to rule that administrative bodies can't simply enforce policies or guidelines as statements as if they have the force of law, because they don't.
Right, right. And as you know, Michael, I'm in the process of editing my book on professional. And my theory on this is that what we're seeing is professional bodies the world around connecting, right? If you look at the Jordan Peterson case, you have the idea that your complainant doesn't have to know you, doesn't have to be in your country. So then you have the idea that all of a sudden your professional body can work in a globalist way, right? And you have professional bodies going through in every type of way to earn a living, right? Every type of way to earn a living is getting its own professional body, not just the ones for doctors, not just the ones for lawyers, but every possible way. Then the same type of committee legislation gets put in place. And if you have your standard of reasonableness, then what is happening is that these professional bodies, who the world around, I've observed, link all the bodies together, and they suspend the citizen from the rights they would otherwise have as a citizen. And they do so on the basis of the reasonable standard and that deference that they give because of that reasonable standard. So your case is important, not merely for doctors, but for every type of organization who can create truth committees that decide a chilling effect on speech. Because once they decide that experts decide what is misinformation or disinformation, and you find that the misinformation and disinformation all follows on one side, then what you create is an extrajudicial international global governance scheme that bypasses the courts. That's the theory behind my book. And so I hope to get it out before you go to court so that this broader discussion on how professional bodies are perverting our society, not just for doctors, but for controlling the speech narrative and controlling whether or not you earn a living. And so what is communism? Right? In a communist state, if you don't agree with the party, you don't earn a living. And this is a mechanism to insert communism within our actual state system. And so until we actually pull up the lens, and I know you have to go in on your legal arguments, but I'm allowed to go in on social arguments because I'm talking about a book on this subject, right? So we get to communism and through the professional bodies. Now, so I hope you'll read the book and give it a good review before it comes out.
I certainly will. And you're really on top of something because it's quite extraordinary how all regulatory bodies around the globe were marching in lockstep on this. I mean, here in Canada, there were three basic COVID restrictions, if I can call them that
Yeah.
were placed on doctors by all colleges of physicians, across the country. How did they all come up with the same three restrictions? And one of the restrictions is a doctor may not say anything contrary to COVID-19 public health measures, recommendations, policies, and so on. And the message was very clearly sent at the beginning. If you don't get on board with this and shut up, we'll take your license. So the coordination around all of this is stunning. And it is a form of bureaucratic tyranny. And I think the great contribution of your book will be to demonstrate that this is a worldwide phenomenon.
A
And
worldwide phenomenon and beyond our doctors, because what we're seeing is that this uh, emphasizes and controls the transnational tropes, the tropes that you are not allowed to disagree with beyond, COVID and vaccines are a whole bunch of other things that support what is essentially our progress towards a new world globalist order where we are governed by a globalist order. And then this is a great segue, Michael, because right now, the reason why I hope that our discussion gets shared more broadly is because Bill C-293 is another mechanism being introduced in Canada to have a globalist order decide so much of our future. And so I shared the bill with you, and I asked for us, you and I to discuss this. And Bill C-293, for everybody's erudition, it is an act. Um, with respect to pandemic preparedness and protection plan, something like that, and I'll share it. But I wrote all the MPs regarding the WHO pandemic treaty and international health regulations. And I wrote them in 2022 in October. And I got a response from very few, but some MPs. One of the MPs that I got a response from was MP Erskine Smith. Now, he tells me in October 2022 that this is part of a conspiracy theory and that I should look at his podcast on conspiracy theories. And lo and behold, that he sends me that email. His office sends me that email in October of 2022. He's the author of the bill, which had its first reading on June 2022. So while telling me, his office is telling me that this is a conspiracy theory, they are taking the elements of the international health regulations and pandemic treaty and domesticating them within Canada. So here it is, an MP who brought this forth as a private member's bill. And private member's bill, well, don't worry. It's not Trudeau's bill. It's not the Liberals' bill. It's not going to be passed. Well, it's passed 3 readings of the House as of June 2024. And it's passed 1 reading of the Senate. And can go and get passed on a 2nd reading of the Senate as early as September 17th. So they go back in session on September 17th. So I'm trying to, get the drums going and to have Canadians weigh in en masse at the Senate and at their MPs to demand that MPs cross the floor and give us a proper election, because Justine Singh is not acting like a minority. He's not acting like opposition. And he's granting all the passage of these horrific bills to Trudeau's Liberals. And so one method to defeat this would be to have MPs cross the floor and vote with the Conservatives and defeat this government and repeal these bills appropriately. Another method, in my letter, I encourage that the Senate to use all their efforts to defeat this bill. And my letter also includes to all the premiers, because I believe we're talking about massive intrusions on their constitutional domain, that they preemptively also use legal action to try to defeat this bill. So I'm going to share screen so we can get into that, you and I. So are you able to see that, Michael?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so again, so I write in October, Erskine Smith, and he is the private members, or he submits this as a private members bill. So it's completed its first reading in June. That means it was drafted far before that, right? So the idea of giving the WHO further information was way further planned. And so that's a concern, that there was this type of deception that we don't have to worry about the WHO intruding. And yet we have a plan here that when we look at it, I'll be able to link for Canadians and for the legal profession how we get to the WHO through this plan. So it's an act respecting pandemic prevention and preparedness, and the House of Commons passed it in June 2005. And it has a One Health approach. And Michael, did you want to weigh in a little bit on the One Health approach?
Right. Well, this is something we dealt with when I was co-chair of the legal committee at the World Council for Health in 2022. So this is an idea that's been rolled out by the WHO and is also talked about a lot by the WEF. And that is a one health policy for the globe. And the WHO is trying to bring this into being by proposing the WHO treaty, which has not yet been passed, which would give the WHO complete control over the public health policies of its member states. So the WHO could declare when there's a public health emergency. It could also dictate all the measures that would be taken by the member state to deal with it. So it would be a transfer of sovereignty on a massive scale from member states to the WHO, an unelected body that's run by a former neo-Marxist from Ethiopia.
Who's
So
been accused of genocide by his own Ethiopians. He's been accused of genocide, and I have a post on that. So he's disappeared journalists, imprisoned people. There's been mass deaths. There's been all kinds of accusations that how did a person with that kind of resume make it to a position of such control and authority over our world, where morality, it seems, would be the last thing he should be in charge with, or our freedoms. The problem I have with this collaborative approach is that it focuses, right? So focus implies that, laser, uh, on the human, the animal, the plant, the ecosystem health, and the welfare interface. So, and welfare interface means essentially your citizen relationship with your government. That's the welfare interface. So anything. So all of that is, quote, central to preventing the risk of a future pandemic. So it's not only in the preamble, it's in the body of the bill that the plan itself has to focus on anything under the sun. So we are doing in this grant, in this bill, a transfer of power in that anything that they put in the plan can be anything that they focus on in this broad. It's under the sun. It's a plant. It's an animal. It's a human. It's an ecosystem. And it's a welfare interface. So wow, that's a big broad. It's overly broad. It's an overly broad grant of power. And why is it that the senators or the MPs could look at this and think, oh, well, it's a health approach. That's not a health approach. That's a way to skirt narrowing the mandate and, in fact, increasing the mandate to anything under the sun. So that is a massive
right. And Lisa,
overreach.
and what you're pointing out here, which is super important, is that they've gone from this idea of One Health, as something, as a public health policy, to something much, much broader in this legislation. I mean, One Health now, as you're pointing out, means control over everything.
Everything.
And so it is like, this is the true face of totalitarianism. Through this One Health approach now, they're going to try to control, as we'll see as we go through the bill, all aspects of our lives. And so this really is potentially a bureaucratic coup.
It's a beyond bureaucratic coup, because when these powers are invoked, the WHO itself is declaring an emergency. So the ability for Canadians, my concern is that when you're in an emergency, the suspension of rights is deemed justified, whether, justified. And so we've seen the massive intrusion on Canadian rights. And then we see the ability to declare an emergency while a massive totalitarian coup in transfer of power is happening. And so, this is an all hands on deck. We should not allow this bill to pass. We have to communicate en masse through the legal profession, through all our contacts, that this is an egregious, really. And then the purpose of the act. So we're getting into the actual purpose, and is to prevent the risk of. Now, there's no material risk, right? Any risk, any infinitesimal risk of a pandemic is part and parcel of where they get their authority from. And again, that is overly broad. When we look at how things are defined in legislation and risk. Well, what is a risk of a pandemic? And I'm going to take you and our viewers to the here it is, right here. The Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And it will inform us on how experts in public health really decide what is a risk of a pandemic. So getting back to the legislation here.
Could I just make a point about this, Lisa? And
Absolutely.
this is very important as a broader point about what's happening here. And this bears directly on the Trozy case and the other cases that I've been fighting, is that the colleges want to proceed against doctors based on a speculation that what they're saying may cause patient harm. So normally in the law, we require a strict nexus between something that's supposedly an offense and a certain type of harm that's recognized by the law. So we require normally a degree of probability that can be proved in evidence. But as part of this totalitarian move on the part of regulatory colleges, they have dispensed with that concept in law. So the mere speculation without proof that somebody might be saying something or doing something that would cause harm is sufficient to take action and to prosecute. And so this is like the end of one of the most basic principles of our of the Western approach to law. And it's reflected right here in Section 2 of this act.
Yes, it is. And okay, we are going to see, let's pay attention to the agencies that are involved, because I want you to focus on this. Because we're at the end of the act, I'm going to take you someplace else, the viewers someplace else. I know you know where we're going with this, but it's the Ministry of Health, okay? Must establish the pandemic prevention and preparedness plan. Okay. And again, prevent the risk of and prepare for disease outbreaks that could lead to pandemics, right? So to get in, this plan doesn't have to deal with real reasonable probability, like you were saying, of a pandemic, but it only has to could lead to pandemic and prevent the risk of. It's very broad language. It's too broad of a grant, in my humble opinion. And then as well as the projected timeline. So again, here again, we're seeing this is very broad.
Yeah, it means the decision could be made on a purely subjective basis.
Yes, on a subjective basis, for sure. And all the while the WHO is saying this is an emergency. And so you have the reluctance of perhaps judges to weigh in on Canadian rights while this is invoked, right? And we'll see the control over communications come. And that's also problematic with our current censorship climate. Okay, identify the key drivers of pandemic risk and describe. They get to describe, they get to author this, they get to own this. How Canadian activities, domestic and abroad. So here's a jurisdictional item that Canadians, no matter where they are, domestic and abroad, contribute to the risk. So their activities, what are those activities? What activities do they get to weigh in on? Are activities, pardon me, domestic and abroad, are brought into this bill. And again, you can probably agree with me that that is a jurisdictional globalist, very broad brush in legislation.
Well, and if I could just say, if you're in the United States, you're under US law, you're not under Canadian law. And so through this bill, Canada is asserting that if you're in another country, you're still being, governed by Canadian law, which is very questionable. This would be called in conflicts law an extra-jurisdictional problem. But just to make common sense of it, I mean, this is expressing a reach of Canadian law, which it couldn't possibly have.
Right, unless the intent is to have a globalist network through this legislation that you're not able to challenge. And there is a provision on jurisdiction that I'm going to take you to. So ensure sustained collaboration, sustained. So sustained all the time, right? Sustains happening all the time. So they're always collaborating with the Ministry of Health, provincial governments, Indigenous communities, um, to in the development of the plan in order to align the approaches and address any jurisdictional challenges. So, and again, any
Right.
jurisdictional challenge, let me tell you, there's several that are involved here. So if you're looking at health, that's the grant of the province, right? And you're going to see that it talks about our resources, that it talks about if the resources and the utilization of resources, it talks about land use. All of that means that they get a broad reach into what the Constitution has already provided to the provinces, but they have to always sustain, be working on jurisdictional challenges. So the first one we looked at, hey, there's the jurisdiction of whether or not a Canadian piece of legislation should be able to affect Canadians living abroad. Second, what about the jurisdictional challenge that the provinces might have between, the federal government passing a law that significantly curtails their role in health and resources management, right? The third one is the jurisdiction of the courts to bring this in line. I really feel that any jurisdictional issue or challenge is broad enough to have a direct salvo and coup on the court's role in curtailing the legislative and executive branch. And also, when we see this, the international award of jurisdiction, we're going to get to the UN in here. We're going to get to the WHO in here. So that's the fourth jurisdiction. And there's a jurisdiction over personal sovereignty and the idea of inalienable rights, concepts like Nuremberg, and that jurisdiction, my personal jurisdiction, that may be affected. So I see 5 possible jurisdictions that they're going to overcome those challenges with a sustained effort.
Right.
And on the
And Lisa, this goes to an earlier point about totalitarianism. I mean, this is the very essence of a totalitarian approach, is that there are no jurisdictional boundaries. There are no legal boundaries to
yes.
the power of the state. And I think the way you're talking about this, that expresses that problem very clearly.
And so I'm hoping that our discussion is dispositive among many legal communities that, are analyzing this, or, oh, this is climate change or green, or this is, I'm not going to scratch the surface, or, this is preventing pandemics. We want to prevent those and not scratch the surface. We need to start scratching the surface on the analysis of how our societies are changing, because we are going from a freedom-based society to a permissive-based society where freedom is 2 feet in front of you at the end of a QR code. So it's green until it's red, and it's arbitrary, and your power to push back is infinitesimal. Like, it is so small. So let's talk about this. Provide training programs, including means not limited to, collaborative activities with other levels of government. So they get to embed themselves and train other levels of government. This is, sustained effort all the time, getting into our government, getting into all administrative areas, including Indigenous communities. And I really hope they speak up, and relevant agencies. Um, I have some very sobering analysis to bring forth in here, because, as you know, Michael, what one OECD country does, the next do. And we saw that parroting in COVID-19. And so New Zealand passed similar legislation to this and also published their plan. So their plan, the relevant agencies that they're talking about, are that they're training the police for civil authority to assist the chief medical officer of health and any of the chief officer of medical health's employees, right, in a few key areas. And I'm only going to mention 2. That the civil authority, you get to train your civil authority, right? Your police, your paramedics, we'll talk about Canada in a bit. to perform functions that are awarded to the Chief Medical Officer of Health under the plan that came out of their act. And that includes quarantining people, places, so what, a whole town, animals, things. So they can grab, take modes of transportation, they can take houses, they can take people, and the police are allowed to use force if necessary. So, they don't give us what the plan they want to implement is, but we can look at New Zealand's plan. And the second thing that civil authority is entitled to do is that while you're under quarantine because, you're sick, you're under quarantine, you're possibly sick, they can assist the Chief Medical Officer of Health or their employees to administer a preventative medication. So that's forced vaccination by cop, right? So when we see relevant agencies and training them, if we look to New Zealand and what happened with New Zealand's plan, it is dystopia beyond belief. It is a police state over your personal autonomy at all times.
Right. And this goes back to what RFK Jr. was talking about in his book, The Real Dr. Fauci, which is that since 1999 in North America, there have been a collaborative activities and training programs involving intelligence agencies, defense personnel, and law enforcement to deal with the pandemic. And that explains in some ways how quickly oppressive measures were rolled out by all governments in North America to deal with the so-called pandemic. And so this more or less instantiates what is already there, but it could take it to the next level, which is really troubling.
It's extremely troubling. This bill should require all MPs to cross. Leave Trudeau and Singh on one side with Friedland and any other WEF. Just leave them. So the relevant agencies, the other dystopia here is that the National Defense Act was recently changed. It was announced by Blair and Trudeau. Saw it on a Twitter feed that allows the Army for the first time to be used for civil authority. So the first time in Canadian history, we have a Defense Act that allows the military to be used against Canadians. So combine that with what's going on with the plan in New Zealand, combine that with relevant agencies. They don't need to tell me that they're talking about the Army. I know where that's going. And then CBC did an article on Blair bemoaning the fact that he can't get new immigrants in the Army fast enough because of all the checks that they have to do in the foreign countries that they come through, and he would like to fast track that. So you have the idea of newly minted Canadians who welcome, that's great, but do they know the rights that we have had for generations that we need to preserve? And if he's bringing them into civil authority and these people here, this new plan gets to train them for things that we're seeing in New Zealand, that's problematic. So, you need a whole context approach to look at what's moving forward as a result of this bill. Okay. Describe the state of research in relation to preventing and responding to infectious disease that could lead to pandemics. I'll let you open up on this, and then I'm going to take you to that Chan article. My biggest concern is they get to say what the research is, right? They get to describe the state of the research, right? So the plan says the research is this, right? This is an own the science, right? This is, the science, the experts govern us, right? There's a group of people whose intellect is superior to ours that are not humans because they cannot be flawed. They cannot make errors. They cannot be, corrupted. They cannot have conflicts of interest. They cannot be bought. They are the science people. And the rest of us with the same intellect, perhaps even superior because we're critical thinkers, cannot discuss what the state of the research is, the research, the science. And to just take you through on where this is going and how tenuous this all is, let's go to Harvard. This is Harvard T.H. Chan, Coronavirus and Climate Change. Okay. How is it that climate change is producing pandemics, right? So this means, and we're going to actually see this in the bill, that if controlling the greenhouse gases and controlling how we get our food and what we're eating, that's going to reduce pandemics. And remember, it's any risk of pandemics that could cause. So no matter how tenuous the link is, because they've got the research, they get to broaden their area in which they can be dystopic and control Canadians. Okay, so let's find out their logic here. This is Harvard Public Health. So public health is where we're headed with the plan. As the planet heats up, animals big and small on land and sea are headed to the poles to get out of the heat. They're just galloping at all times. You just go out and you'll know where north is because the animals are all going north, right? I don't know which way to turn. I don't know which way's north. Mom, look, the animals. They're, that's north. Oh, right. Okay, they're headed, up Yonge Street right now. That means animals are coming into contact with other animals. They normally wouldn't. They're having cigarettes, doing their, math with the Trudeau drugs, and creates an opportunity for pathogens to get into new hosts, right? So the root causes of climate change increase the risk of pandemics. Okay, wow. Let's talk about this. Deforestation. Okay, that increases pandemics, and it occurs mostly for agricultural purposes. So are we going to see in this bill? Yes, we are. Going after agriculture? Yes, we are. It is the largest cause of habitat loss worldwide. Okay, let's talk about the circular reasoning there. So we want to solve for climate change, right? Because people might starve. And so what are we going to do? Remove methods of agriculture that feed people. Oh, okay. And so we're also going to get at it through the idea that we're going to give governments the power to prevent pandemics because of deforestation, right? So pandemics are bad because humans might suffer, and we're going to solve for that by making humans suffer a lot. So it's, the absurd circular logic here. Loss of habitat forces animals to migrate and potentially contact other mammals and share germs. Large livestock farms can serve as a source of spillover infections from animals to people. And
But by the way, Lisa, in this context, this
yeah,
might explain also why certain globalists and large investment organizations representing globalists are acquiring farmland all over North America, as
yeah,
that will put them in a position to
control the
to
food,
right
right?
to bring this approach to bear, and they won't have to consult any government about it.
It's a holodomor. Less demand for animal meat and more sustainable animal husbandry could less decrease emerging infectious disease and lower greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so we need to eat less meat in order to not have pandemics, in order for the animals not to be stomping north all the time, and in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see they are going after climate lockdowns, they are going after agriculture, and they're placing it in the research, because this is Harvard, you know. Um, and we have many reasons to take climate action to improve health and reduce risks of infection. So then you see that air pollution, and their version of air pollution is CO2, right? Air pollution will make you die of a pandemic faster. Now, I have an environmental science degree with a minor in chemistry, and I did science well enough to get into law school. Let me just ask you, Michael, if you heat your pasta by taking a flamethrower to the air in the kitchen and hoping to transfer the heat from the air to boil the pasta water.
I've never tried it, but it wouldn't occur to me to try it.
Wouldn't occur. Yeah, because there's a law of thermodynamics that heat moves from a hot substance to the less hot substance, right? The cold doesn't come in. Heat is energetic, it's kinetic, it moves out. And when you actually consider there's a volumetric thermal mass in air. So it has a low volumetric thermal mass. The ability to hold, you look at a rock or concrete or even water, it can hold thermal mass, heat, very easily. And so, you know, whether or not that notion can get discussed when people own the science and own the discussions on science is out there, right? But CO2, there's one equation, it's photosynthesis, 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O gives us 1 glucose molecule and 6 O2. And if you remove either water or carbon life cycle ceases to operate, right? The idea that they quantify it as pollution, but it's in your lungs at such high concentrations, right? The concentrations that it's in your lungs or even in the house far exceeds the concentrations outside, right? And they pump CO2 into greenhouses in order to increase the growth of tomatoes and other plants. It acts as a fertilizer. So they've now demonized our CO2 and call that pollution. So when they say air pollution increases the risk of getting coronavirus and making symptoms worse, they get in that causal effect where then they get to govern whether or not we have our vehicles, whether or not we have industry, whether or not GDP is going to perform. It then allows them to occupy another area in which you're not allowed to disagree with. So I'll go, back to the bill. If anybody wants, I'll put the link on the TH Chan and just how many tenuous leaps of logic you have to get to in order that you can't have a car because of reducing pandemics. So that's the state of research. Harvard's the state of research on preventing and responding to infectious disease. And that can also include, responding. That means, like, are you allowed to have ivermectin? Are you allowed to refuse a preventative treatment? Are you allowed to just convalesce and get well and have natural immunity? So this one is also problematic. Provide for the establishment of an interlinking of surveillance systems for infectious disease in Canada and for infectious disease of concern outside Canada. So immediately, we already have a level of surveillance going on in Canada that exceeds what our appetite for surveillance should be. So it gives anyone who's in control of this plan the ability and to establish and link surveillance systems. So known online, known in the smart city, right? We're ramping up with cameras in our smart city on every street light. So we're known, right? And so it gives them power over that infrastructure. So on the basis of reducing risk of pandemics, they now walk in to owning our surveillance system, establishing it, linking it, and for infectious disease in Canada and for infectious disease of concern outside Canada.
And if I might add here, Lisa, as of 2022, the WHO was bragging that it already had set up its own independent surveillance centers, 2 of them in Europe. I forget where the 3rd one is, but they were planning to increase them. So while all this is going on, the WHO is rolling out its own public health surveillance systems, nominally to assist in this this project of monitoring infectious diseases, but which obviously will have numerous nefarious purposes.
And we're going to see even further grants over our communication further down in the bill. Um, Support local public health. Okay, so public, we think public health, right, are ours. I'm going to show you public health is not us. It's not who we think they are. And primary care capacity building. So Public Health in Toronto recently proposed the idea of decriminalizing all hard drugs. Right? Well, does that sound like something that is safe or effective? And what the concerns were that in BC, when that was affected, that there was a massive amount of deaths in BC and mass amounts of new addiction, and that the proponents of that, safe drug sites now don't want it in BC, and they're asking for Trudeau to reverse it. Meanwhile, Public Health in Toronto wanted to do the same thing with two differences. One, there would be no legal limit on what you were allowed to carry for substances like meth or heroin, right? So that gets into trafficking, and it disables the police from being able to arrest traffickers of these hard drugs. And there was no lower age limit on who could possess it. And so that's a war on our schools because it takes the administration and nullifies their ability to say that's illegal. You can't have meth or opioids or, heroin at our schools. And so we had that come from our public health. And so I want us to start thinking about public health, as perhaps they don't have our best interests and shouldn't have the total lockdown on what communications get set, what treatments get set, what happens in our communities.
I would also say, Lisa, this is part of a strategy to keep us drugged and divided, and to keep in order to keep our eye off the ball as to what is really going on here in terms of rolling out the bureaucratic surveillance state. So I think it's part of a political strategy. It has nothing to do with public health.
It has nothing to do with public health, but what an excuse that public health gets to show who they are. And we should look at that, and we should reflect that if meth is safe, if heroin is safe for children, right? If they can have them in schools at any amounts, right? If all these hard drugs are safe, well, really, what else is safe? Identify preparedness strategies for public health services, including the protection of vulnerable and marginalized population.
Yeah, always. I mean, that's there we have the EDI agenda, and we're going to hear the word equity before this is over. So I mean, this is truly like a synoptic bill. Also, it's going to promote the EDI agenda because, of course, anything can be done in the name of dealing with the vulnerable, the marginalized, and the disadvantaged. I mean, it's the ultimate justification if you don't have a compelling public health justification. So this is also really troubling.
Right. Well, we've seen research out of these top institutions that, that the rainbow suffers disproportionately as a result of climate change, right?
Right.
So if we
Of
do not
course.
address climate change, the rainbow is going to, and I think the rainbow is going to suffer disproportionately through this authoritative rule. And the reason why is they believe that, everything that is being pushed forth right now, and not all of them are very gullible, is pushed forth for their sake. And what I truly believe is that what we're doing is neutralizing a part of the population from standing up against this authority. And the rainbow has had to fight for its rights historically. And so they would be a key element of the population to push against tyranny. And they can't because they believe that authority is actually helping them. So it's a very neutralizing
And
strategy.
it's very clever what's been done because they've been co-opted by the EDI agenda. And so they think that is all for their benefit, but it's going to flip around and they're going to find out one day that they are under surveillance too, and they are controlled. But by that time,
Right.
it will be too late for them.
Well, that's because we're going to not be too late because we're going to reach them and they're going to work with us.
Mhm.
So the vulnerable and marginalized communities were also the reason why we had to shut down our economy. We had to shut everything down. And the criticism was that the lockdowns were too harsh, right? They shut down small businesses. They were selective. This was a war on GDP. This was a war on our economy. This was a war on small businesses. It was utilized because of marginalized populations before. So I see this as a worry of, yeah, we're going to see DEI. Well, yeah, we're going to see, climate change brought in through this because I've seen all the studies that say, transgender people suffer disproportionately to climate change. And so we have to protect them from climate change and from, so you can't drive a car. But just remember the transgender people don't get to drive the car either. So it's going to take it, in a very dystopian way. It's going to be against our economy.
Right.
Um,
And this is where this language again is so vexing because, who are the vulnerable and the marginalized from an economic standpoint during the lockdowns? Are small business people. And so in the name of protecting the vulnerable and the marginalized, we took advantage of those who didn't have power to fight back
yeah,
and who were replaced by the big box stores and other large concerns. And they were in fact turned into a new marginalized class when in fact small business is the backbone of the economy. And so that's just an absolutely perverse result of this entire thing.
right. So unless you really sit and start discussing how this can be utilized, how it was utilized, you don't understand that this right here is a war on GDP. And it looks like it's a very fluffy, well, this is going to be great. We're going to help marginalized communities. But that's not how it worked out last time. And having read the research, it's going to be getting us out of our cars. It's going to be getting us into a smaller square footage. It's going to be changing how we eat
Right.
food.
Right. The war on prosperity, the war on GDP, as I think you accurately,
Yeah.
that's a very good way of expressing that. The war on GDP is to keep us, in a state of self-concern. Again, so we can be controlled more easily, and so our gaze is deflected from what's going on around us to our immediate survival. And so this is a totalitarian technique that is used by all authoritarian governments.
You're right. And I think we're seeing in our discussion, I think a way to analyze this bill that I hope, gets around and that gets viral enough for the who's who to start thinking about why we can't have this approach in our country and beyond for other countries. Because if we succeed in pushing back, then this approach that's going in other OECD countries, might be successful. Here's the working conditions of essential workers across all sectors. So all sectors, all of a sudden, they get to talk about what are working conditions. And remember, we're seeing that CO2 is a problem, that greenhouse gas is a problem. So all sectors and the working conditions might mean climate lockdowns. What are your working? You have to work from home 3 days a week. You have to work from home 4 days a week. Well, people think that's great, right? Until they find out they also can't drive a car and they can't get meat and they can't leave the city and et cetera and et cetera. And I'm just going to put up something here that I've been working on. This is another globalist organization that links all of our communities around the world together, and it's C40. And the reason why I'm going to take this little segue is that we're going to see the elements of other globalist organizations and intents within this bill. And so the Global Covenant of Mayors.org, I think it maps 13,000 cities across all the world. And what that does is gives a greenhouse gas budget to every city. And then they have to adopt mitigation strategies to do so. And then C40 is the idea that that greenhouse gas budget that is given to the city is drilled down to the greenhouse gas budget of the individual. And we're just going, it's created by the University of Leeds. It's a very high gloss report. They're listed as necessary changes. It's unbelievable how extensive this research is. And, it's urban consumption. You have to, in order to save the climate and sort of, get back to the weather in 1880, we're going to have this urban consumption reduced. So here's the targets. Okay, we're going to reduce our housing. This is my theory why Justin Trudeau hasn't built anything, is because we're supposed to reduce by 20% our bills and start using our own housing, existing housing. He's just going to take that tax, that underutilized home tax, and you're going to be taxed to live alone. You're going to have to take in people. You're going to have a square foot allocation. Here's your food. You eating? No, you're eating too much. That's how we solve for climate change. The government has to be on your fork. Again, this is another totalitarian approach. Private transport has to be reduced. You're wearing too much clothes, Michael. You and I, if we took off 66% of our clothes right now, I think we'd be cold. Electronic appliances and aviation. You leaving the city has to reduce. And so quickly, I'll look at 13% of emissions are from food. And by 2030, the consumptive intervention is a dietary change. So the reason why I'm taking you here is because the next stages of the bill talk about the dietary changes that get granted by this bill C-293. So the ambitious target is 0 kilograms of meat consumption by 2030. Well, if it prevents a pandemic, I mean, you can't eat meat. And 0 dairy and 2,500 kilocalories. So right? So your government's on your app and it's surveilling you, and it's, don't take that next bite. Michael, save that for tomorrow. Spit it out. You hit your calorie intake. Your clothing has to go down to 3 new clothing items per person per year. Right? So we live in Canada. Are we getting boots or a hat or a coat? Take off, keep cutting little pieces off our coat to sew our underwear. Or do we all have rainbow uniforms? I have no idea. And then private transport, 0 private vehicles by 2030. So, it's a little bit excessive. And I'm going to morph back there, but I really want our viewers to take a look. The ambitious target on the consumptive intervention is to reduce the number of flights, and it's 1 short haul flight per person every 3 years. So, right? So you don't have a
Well,
car.
that's the end of my career right there.
Right. Michael, you don't have a car. You're in your smart city, right? You have to do this for climate change. You can't leave through the airport. And where are you going to go anyways? You're going to go to your next smart city. You're going to go to your next smart city. And do you want to? So I'm going to go back to our legislation because we're going to get into that. I want you just to think about that. The availability and management of relevant stockpiles. So when I looked at stockpiles in New Zealand, it dawned on me stockpiles is food because it's including testing and personal protective,
It could mean anything.
It could mean anything. They get, under this bill, access to manage anything. So when you say
there's no definition in the bill of a relevant stockpile, so the decision makers will make it mean whatever they want it to mean at any point.
Yeah, water has to be stockpiled, food has to be stockpiled. The surge capacity of human resources required for testing, they're going to go, testing, and we know what that means if they get to train relevant agencies and the armies in charge of civil authority, well, you get that PCR whether you want it or not, and someone's going to do it for you. The surge capacity of human resources. So, they dictate what the government spends on in terms of human resources. They dictate the control of all resources by calling them relevant stockpiles. This is dystopic, and I have the ability, and you have the ability to see where they went because we've been thinking about this. We've been seeing this elsewhere. We've been, I'm crafting a book on the municipal deep state, and I'm putting forth all of this dystopia. Um, so are the people drafting or passing this legislation just going along party lines and just, oh, it's pandemic. We don't like those. Let's prevent them. This is about preventing. As long as you name the bill something that no one can disagree with, then you get it passed. Okay, and here's one I hate. Communication of risk to the public. So who owns what the risk is? Who gets to tell us how dangerous the pathogen is? Who gets to tell us that climate change and the greenhouse gases are why you need to be locked down? Who gets to own all of that communication? For me, having looked at, the files that you're working on, this is the censorship. This is the reason why no one else can communicate the risk. No one else can analyze it. No one else can pass it on to their friends. No one else can have that discussion. This is owning what the risk is and owning the communication on that risk. And so here it appoints a group of individuals who were given the same brains as we were and the same God-given five senses and an intellect, and they own the analysis. They own the communication. And that's what we saw in the first pandemic. And it had a real control matrix over everybody.
Yeah,
And
and we
so,
know communication here means the use of military-grade propaganda techniques because those were used during the pandemic.
yeah,
So we know that's already baked in the cake. So when they talk about communication, that's what they mean. They mean weaponizing communication against the public. That's what Section 5 is about.
that is really wise, Michael. That is really wise. It's about how they communicate by weaponizing it and by preventing dissident voices that would otherwise, cause people to think. Because truth really is a cure for a lot of things. Because when people hear it for the first time, and noodle it around, they start actually acknowledging perhaps what it is that they're seeing themselves or their own observations.
Right. And the communication of risk may be the communication of those who don't go along with the risk narrative and who present a risk because they don't go along.
Right. So here's another dystopia. Um, Provide the measures for measures. Okay, that's pretty broad. Measures, including, right, but not limited to training to increase the ability of healthcare workers in a range of settings to manage sudden and unexpected increases in patient volumes.
Oh, that is
Right.
it's so dangerous if you know what's going on in our hospitals today. And I've been involved in some of those cases. This is really, really dangerous.
It's dangerous. I looked at again, the New Zealand plan, and maybe, you and I in a separate one, Zoom should talk about that. Because it's training firemen and paramedics to deal with mass sudden deaths. Okay. So why is it the plan is considering a whole bunch of mass sudden deaths? And so it's a training about that in New Zealand. So it's very dystopic. It's very concerning. And that's what came out of, their legislation.
And I would say here, you have to read this again in context in terms of what has happened during the so-called pandemic and afterwards. And increasing the ability of healthcare workers in a range of settings means equipping them to override everyone's right to informed consent.
Yeah, the minute when they talked about what the risk is, I knew they controlled the narrative on how dangerous something was. And
And they will also control your access to healthcare. And you may end up in emergency, but if you're not part of their triage priority based on these criteria, they will just send you home to die. I've seen it happen.
yeah, include the following information to be provided by the Ministry of Industry. So, that when I have variously said this is a war on GDP, when we get to the Ministry of Industry and we're seeing that, small businesses, industry, there's a war on us being able to have a living, right? And the cost of living because of their expenditures is becoming literally the cost of living. And for some, they're falling between the cracks. So they get to decide through this plan the manufacturing capacity in Canada with respect to any product relevant to pandemic preparedness. So, well, they're already saying climate change and cars and what have you is part of reducing pandemics. So they get to really increase through the Ministry of Industry the control of what gets made in Canada. And because we know how broad that can be, it can be anything. And then it says including stuff that, we might be worried about: vaccines, testing equipment, personal protective equipment.
And we get back to definitions here again. So any product relevant to pandemic preparedness, well, you're already pointing out that can mean just about anything. But it can mean just about anything because there's no definition of that in the legislation. So again, this just will be arbitrary and subjective.
Could be
And
jails, right?
sure.
Could be jails. And the measures that the Ministry of Industry intends to take to address any supply chains gaps identified. So is the Ministry of Industry going to be part of that supply? What did we see? They get stockpiles, right? So this is back to the stockpiles,
Mhm.
right? What supply chain gaps are we going to have? Or, are they anticipating that, food isn't coming to the city?
Yeah, and also you can see this is an attack on the market because supply chain gaps are normally dealt with by the
Market.
market,
Yeah.
And by demand. And that works pretty well. But apparently the Minister of Industry knows better than the market.
Right. Well, the Ministry of Industry, as directed by whoever is doing this plan, the communications capacity. Okay, so remember I said, well, okay, we're going to be talking about a lot of control over surveillance systems. So the communications capacity and infrastructure, wow, that's big. They get all our communications, all our infrastructure for, right? Electronic platforms. Oh, that's the internet. That's your phone, that's your computer, that's your, vaccine passport. Tools, that's pretty broad. Including, so again, including is that word that it's not limited to electronic applications. So it just, anything with related to communication is covered and awarded to the Ministry of Industry that they get to control through preventing pandemics that enable contact tracing of persons exposed to infectious disease that could lead to pandemics, right? So we're not even in the realm of, a very, very big illness and they get the communication strategy. And so I'm looking at through some lawyers in the US studying our 5G. And that's a separate topic that we could go into, but there are some energies that can come out of 5G that can be beaming and directed and work the same way anti-crowd weapons that the military's developed, in that they can be used energetically and be a weapon themselves. So few people know about that, and 5G was really pushed forth. So that's a whole.
Yeah, it's no mistake that they rolled out 5G and started putting up these towers in the middle of the lockdowns. So that certainly had to be planned. And also, let's just go back to this point that we covered at the beginning, which is that you don't have to have any probable cause, no probable link between the evidence before you and the possibility of some harm, right? So that means in order to prevent any harm that may exist somehow, you will be subject to continual surveillance. So there's no trigger for the surveillance. It could be continual because it's not constrained by any legal conduct that makes any sense.
And they use the word sustained, right? They have to have sustained cooperation at all the time with all levels of government and indigenous and everything else. And it's all, you're right.
So yeah, that's digital totalitarianism right there.
We have the digital totalitarianism. They control our markets. This is a control over GDP. So I really want people who are, who stayed on the edge, who didn't weigh in on COVID, who said, well, it's all over. We don't want to think about it. We're fine. Everything's going to move forward. So who are starting to feel maybe things aren't fine in this country. Oh, we're getting to an election. Well, what happens when they can declare martial laws? They can declare that, your right to have an election is gone. So I want our discussion to be live enough to people that they consider the other implications that will really personally affect them. Here we are. Remember, I took you to C-40 and we're going to phase out meat. So reducing pandemics means that they have to work with the Ministry of Agriculture and Agri-Food, the Ministry of Industry, provincial governments should provide measurements. Okay, this is to reduce antimicrobial resistance. Okay, maybe that's good. I'll give them that. But let's go to the next one. Regulate commercial activities that can contribute to pandemic risk.
Yeah.
So we saw that T.H. Chan, Harvard, thinks that agriculture, growing crops, move in intersection of animals with people, and that migration can all cause pandemics. Okay, and so they get to govern, regulate industrial animal agriculture. And then they say they get to promote commercial activities that help reduce pandemic risk, whatever those are, right? So if it's greenhouse gases, it's anything that, you living basically expels CO2 all the time, including the production of alternative proteins. So there's your bugs. There's your meat goo that they
Well,
print.
and this is a justification for a Soviet-style command and control economy. Like, make no mistake about it. They've given themselves an excuse to intervene in the economy in any way and at any time. So this is really extraordinary.
This is extraordinary. And if you take the time to read it in the context of what else we know, this is extraordinary. Okay. And it's regulate commercial activities that can contribute to pandemic risk. So anything that they decide,
And by the
including
way,
industrial.
Lisa, I just note here that in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we do not have a right to private property. And so that means, in principle, the government can interfere with your private property and your private businesses at any time. And there are some expropriation acts in place that give you compensation in some provinces. There may be a federal act as well. But
Well,
as
we're
a matter
getting
of
there.
principle, we do not have any constitutional check on the government's control over your business or your private property.
So then we get to phase out. So they get to promote anything that they says reduce pandemic risk. And reproduction. I've read the studies that you reproducing, increases pandemic risk by increasing the greenhouse gas, having children, right? So,
Another useless eater.
right, another useless eater. This is horrific. Phase out commercial activities that disproportionately contribute to pandemic risk, including activities that involve high-risk species. So birds are now high-risk species, cows are high-risk species. So you eating meat is, all they have to do is define us as a high-risk species, right? And then, oh no, and that's sort of the demonic idea. This whole net zero is very anti-life. Instead of saying we're going to have some mitigation strategies, we have, we're we're going to use our intellect to mitigate whatever happens with climate change. We've had 6 ice ages, 5 interglacial periods, which are the warming periods. Or, even the medieval warming period had grapes growing in northern England. We still haven't even reached that level of warming. And when you think of an ice age covering miles and miles of Toronto in ice, it's hard to see how the evolution of climate really should get us to totalitarianism, because we're probably in a warming period having a better life than we ever could, than living with woolly mammoths. Um, Now, again, here, just in case you didn't think it was going to be about climate change, here it is. It's the Ministry of Environment, and they get um, provincial ministers, and they get a summary of changes of land use in Canada. Okay, so this is really important because it's what you were talking about. It's about expropriation. Remember when we looked at T.H. Chan's study, is that agriculture and, where living where you're going to run into animals is going to increase pandemics. So if you're, you have a cottage, or you live on the outskirts of town, or you live, in a rural community, well, they're going to have to change that land use because you're running into animals. And so this should go to our property bar, right? This should go to our property bar. This should go to all the real estate agents. Then we're talking literally about expropriation. This should go to our um, defense lawyers who know constitutional law, who see this as setting up a prison without charge, without you know the rule of law, because you don't know what you've done, but you're getting punished. You're not getting your food. You're
And you know
getting
what will happen?
surveilled.
This will eventually percolate down to the municipal level. If you want to bring some kind of seek a zoning change before a committee of adjustment because you want to do something with your property, be prepared now. You're going to have to meet all of these environmental and pandemic risk criteria. And so eventually this is going to affect the way you live, the value of your property, the degree of intervention in your life. It's going to be
Well,
bad.
100%, and it's galloping. It's people think we have some time, but um, in Winnipeg right now, there's a plan. It's Plan 2050 that's being implemented. It sounds, oh well, that's a long way away, but it's being implemented in 2025 and has to be implemented by within 3 years. And it includes that if you have a property a third of an acre, you need to put 8 units in it. So you can have just laws act so weaponized that it expropriates you just because you don't have the physical capacity to get any kind of financing to turn your home into an 8 unit place. So if you have a bigger home, well, what happens? So this is about expropriation of people, and if you don't think so, well, that's because you've drank too much of the Kool-Aid.
Right.
Right? A summary of the measures the Ministry of Environment takes to reduce the risk that commercial wildlife trade in Canada and abroad will lead to a pandemic. Or are you hunting? Right? Are I grew up in the north and I ate deer and moose and partridge and so live animal markets. So when they reduce all our meat, are they going to give us B12? Or are we just going to be weak? And this is a
And
real.
wait till their Aboriginal partners learn about this. I mean, they claim in this legislation they're acting for Aboriginal peoples. Take a closer look. I don't think so.
I think they just are going to define Aboriginal to be whoever they want it to be. It'll be an empowered class, and the real Aboriginal will be left. I
Mhm.
think because everything's in definition. If they really cared about Aboriginal, we spent tons on reconciliation, but there's, people who have no water, no clean water. They get the vaccines first, and we've seen how that happens, right? Oh, we're going to protect our marginalized communities, and we're going to have our gay and lesbian community get the vaccines first, and we're going to have our Aboriginals get the vaccine first. I think all of that DEI is just weaponized against us working together. They don't help the Aboriginals, I don't believe. Include a summary to be provided by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on the measures that the minister intends to support global health equity. Okay, so this is printing our money and inflating it until it's worth nothing, right? So we're going to,
So here
print.
we are back to equity. Like, understand what equity is. It's not equal opportunity. Equity replaces equal opportunity. So equity means that the state will determine who gets what, who gets rewarded, who gets punished. The state will determine outcomes based on its own criteria. And so the minute you've got equity in there, you have, again, a totalitarian form of government. And that's really aimed at undermining the most basic promise of the West, which is equal opportunity.
Equity is the same result. So that's the same meat consumption for everybody, the same dairy consumption or dairy alternatives for everyone, the same calories per day. Equity is truly Stalin. And if equity is that, then it does not even have its moral ability to outlaw its worst result.
Mhm.
Right? We can see some of the worst results in history and describe them through the lens of equity and be right. So this is a bait and switch. Equity is not all lattes and pink hair.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's lattes for the protected classes, but for not for those who are not protected.
But who wants to be in a world where you are going to see such ugliness everywhere,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Even if you're in a protected class, just knowing that the amount of suffering your class is imposing on everybody else, this is disgusting.
Well, and that's this whole equity business, and this is not the only place where this concept enters into this, but I mean it's the whole idea of systemic discrimination. So the background to this is the belief that we're living in a systemically discriminatory society that can be divided between the oppressed and the oppressors, or understood as a division between the oppressed and the oppressors. And so you need equity to overcome that. And this is where this enters into the act. I mean, unfortunately, systemic discrimination has been recognized as a matter of judicial notice at the Supreme Court of Canada based on Rosalie Abella's very flawed report, Equality in Employment, which was published in 1984. I was the only person in the country to write a critique of that report. It doesn't prove that we have systemic discrimination in this country at all. But in any event, here we are, 40 years later, and systemic discrimination and the cure for it, which is equity, is with us, and it's being embodied in this legislation and other legislation that's now,
Well, if it can outlaw its worst iteration, it's not a moral program. It really cannot be supported. The other thing I look at when I analyze this is that it creates the need to have some of our biggest do-gooders that really want to change the world for the better, to have them look in the rear view mirror and look behind and look at things that, it was difficult if someone was a slave, right? And so if they're looking back at that and they think they're improving lives of people, and so they think they're doing good, but what they're missing is the biggest power move that is in front of them. Because if you have this surveillance state, if you have this ability to expropriate, they're not going to be that good class. This is this there's no such thing. Humanity is just going to be decimated under totalitarianism. And they're just useful idiots to get the power structure there. And so the people who, might on the left stand up and say, no, I don't want CBDC. I don't want to be expropriated. I want to put food on the table. I don't want my government to control food. I want to earn a living. Those people would be standing up, but they're occupied with power-owned social justice. So power is owning social justice and telling the do-gooders, if you want to be good, you have to virtue signal in this fashion. It's the only way. And so it corrals the people who might otherwise push back. And I want a dialogue that somehow reaches them and says, this is your fight too. This is where real power is moving. Stop looking, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago and work with us. We're your real brothers and sisters. Work with us at pulling down this power structure, because this power structure is going to be for keeps. And so I don't know how we reach them, but if we can, um, it would really be a win in terms of defeating this type of legislation
Well,
and
this
what
is
they
the
have plans.
problem is how to communicate this on a mass scale, how to reach your neighbor, how to reach your friend, how to reach your Uber driver.
Yeah.
This requires some serious thought about how to communicate with others to make these very complicated concepts to make them real and to make them comprehensible and show people how it will impact them in their daily lives. And this is the big challenge in front of us.
It's a big challenge. I am hoping that we can reach some legal professionals through our analysis. Um, so here we are. So that was support global health equity, which means just printing Canadians' money and sending it abroad. And I don't know how Justin Trudeau uses it, but that's what it is. And here we are. In case you wanted to know, the last jurisdiction here set out in consultation with relevant ministries a summary of key cooperative measures or agreements on disease. It could be measures, doesn't even have to be an agreement. We just have some kind of measure on disease outbreak prevention and preparedness between the government of Canada, other foreign governments, key international organizations, including, so not limited to, the World Health Organization, the UN Environment Program, the World Health Organization for Animal Health and Food, and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. So all of a sudden, this is another black box of possible agreements or measures that we don't know what the contents are. It's a black box of legislation that they have the power over. I don't know what they don't have the power over that is being granted in this bill.
Mm-hmm. Right. They can control everything. Everything is up for grabs here. In this very short bill, they've managed to establish a legal structure that will allow them potentially to control everything, and then to bring in foreign actors like the WHO to also dictate the terms on which we will live our lives through backdoor agreements or behind the scenes agreements that we will never even know about.
Right. So it's the federal government's bill. The federal government has this minister of health that can have a cooperative measure with the federal government, right? So the executive branch can have a new measure with the executive branch itself and come up with itself, just have an agreement, just have a measure. Does not have to be, something passed, does not have to be something that is discussed or debated. It's just
this will raise an interesting jurisdictional question, and I'm talking like a nerdy lawyer. But if you enter into some kind of agreement with the World Health Organization or the UN, the question is that a treaty? And if it's a treaty, then you have to actually bring it before Parliament and have a majority vote on it in order to make it part of our domestic laws. So this raises a big issue about how these agreements will.
This actually obviates the need to do that. You don't have to have a treaty or an agreement. You could just have a cooperative measure, right?
Right. Yes, that's right. Right. Cooperative measure. It doesn't have to actually be a legal document.
It doesn't have to be a cooperative measure. Okay, so it doesn't have to be public. It doesn't have to be, debated. We don't even have to know about it, but it enables a greater authority of measures that we have no idea. It's a black box.
Right.
It's a black box. But it's key because we know that they're talking about the Food and Agricultural Organization. I've read some of their documents, and I can tell you they don't want us to eat meat at all, right? There's no meat or dairy. And if you want to be a vegetarian, and I at some point in my life was, that's it. And I just became a convenient vegetarian because all my roommates were, and the meat eater, what do you bring to the table when you eat together, right? So, I brought the steak, it's kind of rude. So just by being polite, I ended up being a vegetarian. Yeah. So that's problematic. That has some jurisdictional issues, but we go back to the front of the bill that we have to smooth out all the jurisdiction issues, right? There's no such thing as jurisdiction issues. We get rid of those. So, that's where that was. And set out in consultation with the Ministry of Transport, Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness and other relevant ministers. Right? Wow.
When are we going to bring Oprah into this? I mean, who isn't involved?
Who isn't involved? That's right. Epstein drafted this. That's right.
Right.
So the routes by which and rates at which pathogens could lead to pandemics could enter. Oh, and this is the Dr. Zeus version. Yeah, are they coming by cars? Are they coming by planes? Are they coming by trains? Are they, how are you getting there, right? The places you will go. So they get to shut down the routes of transportation here.
Mhm.
So, and that also means, but they're coming in on ice cars, or they're coming in on the food trucks.
Well, no, forget about the truckers making a second appearance,
Yeah,
right? Right. The
right.
routes will be cut off.
So all of this horror story is to prevent a could cause risk. All of this, all of this.
Mhm.
Um, and considerations. Let's get to the word must. Okay, so what must the plan contain? Multi-sectoral, so everything. Multidisciplinary, so everything. Collaborative, so everybody's involved. Approach known as One Health. That's the third time we learn about One Health. That focuses on laser focus on human, animal, plant, ecosystem, and welfare interface, right? So that's crazy. Take into account the best scientific information available that they define, right? They own the communication of risk and the studies. They get to communicate the studies. Leverage international expertise by using internationally developed metrics. So those are the UN people. And okay, tabling within 2 years after the day on which the act comes into force, the Ministry of Health must prepare a report setting out the plan. New Zealand already has their plan. So this never dawned on anybody who's arguing this to say, would you have a draft plan in place to look at? Oh, it has us being mass quarantined by police. Our houses, our places, our towns, our things, our animals. Can't have a pet, can't have a dog.
Mhm.
And then public it, and once every 3 years they get to do a report and do an updated plan. So see how we survive their first plan. Um, we can't let this go through. Amendment to the Department of Health Act.
Well,
Um,
this is really scary here. We get into the national coordinator. So this is here is the dictator at the top of this pyramid.
yeah. And so for the purpose of the coordinating the activities of the Pandemic Prevention Preparedness Act, the minister shall appoint a national pandemic prevention preparedness coordinator from among the officials of the Public Health Agency of Canada and delegate to the coordinator the powers, duties, and functions that the minister, right? Carte blanche,
That is laughable. That is
right?
laughable.
Any power. They get any power, any duty, any function that
So if
is
you
appropriate.
just imagine, do you want Theresa Tam being the ultimate ruler of Canadian society? That's what you're going to get. Or Bonnie Henry.
No,
She'd be a good candidate for that job.
or worse.
Or worse.
I don't think we've seen the level of where this plan can go.
No, I agree.
I don't say, I think we have to really knock on doors and have them watch our video and have them really think. And now let's talk about public health. I've written an open letter to the Senate about this bill, and I'm going to, when I send our video.
Mhm.
I want people to really, I'm sending it to Pierre Poilievre, every premier of every province, and every senator and every MP. And I want them to think. So, of what they're doing to Canada, to Canadians. And if we stand up, we have a chance to help all the other nations who are under the same rubric of tyranny, because this is a globalist push. So I looked at in 2005, international health regulations were set down, and it required a focal point um, be appointed in each country, and the focal point of the WHO. Now, remember, this involves Minister of Health and Public Health, the plan that we're looking at. So I suspected this is just, I have a sixth sense in a lot of ways. I've tangled with power before, and I suspected that public health wasn't ours. I suspected that Ministry of Health wasn't ours. And I sought out to prove it, and I think I did. So think of the focal point of the WHO essentially as the satellite office of the WHO in your country. And it drills down to public health eventually in your province and city. So when people are getting Theresa Tam's information, do they know that she's actually part of the WHO? So then I found the list of every satellite office, every national focal point in all of the world. And so I wanted to know, well, who were the Canadian focal points? And I have a Substack that really drills down into this. And so for Canada, where's our focal point? The address is 525 23rd Street in Washington, D.C. So that's our focal point. Okay. And it's PAO. Okay. So they change the links periodically. So let's see if this one's still good. Yeah. PAO, the Pan American Health Organization. That's our satellite office. But okay, it becomes a member state. And let's drill into PAO. So what is PAO? And for Canada, let's take a look. And PAO has a health portfolio. And the health portfolio, so these are the health portfolio that PAO are the satellite office of the WHO, very top down, is the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. It's the Canadian Institute of Health Research. So what gets funded, right? What is research? Health Canada. So I guess doctors get told, these are the approaches that you have to do with different health ailments. Patented Medicine Prices Review Board. That's an interesting one because it gives an element of approval over pharmaceutical. So we have the WHO, who has funding through Gavi, which is an organization that is pro-vaccine, is made up of vaccine manufacturers, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We have President Xi appointing Tedros. We have a conglomerate of people who are unaccountable, unelected, protected by diplomatic immunity, drafting the contracts, right? And we have within the WHO's satellite office for Canada, these institutions, and that includes the Public Health Agency of Canada. So when we go back to our act, we have the Ministry of Health. So it sounds like this is a lot of different organizations. The Minister of Health drafting the plan, and the person at the top with all these powers. And if he doesn't have enough powers, we've got to give him or her or they or them more powers. And they're both coming from, since 2005, being the PAHO Health Center for the WHO for Canada. So when you look at the National Focal Point Guide, we already have the potential that the WHO, which is a foreign unaccountable actor, has a bureaucracy in our country through the ministries that we are supposed to trust during a pandemic. And I found that very disturbing. And I think that ties a bow on our discussion that we're having an extrajudicial grant of power of massive enormity go to an organization that may not even be us. So irrespective of whether we prove it's us or not us, the grant of power is so excessive. The grant of power over our Western norms is so excessive, and we are going to suffer as Canadians if this is allowed to stand. And we have
And what people need to understand, Lisa, too, is the nature of the WHO. Um, it's this was a wake-up call for me, but if you take a look at the funding of the WHO, it receives, or its budget is around $7 billion a year, and 1 billion of that 7 billion comes from Bill Gates through Gavi and the Gates Foundation. So this is not a this is
say
not a
hi to Bill.
public interest organization as such, though you might think it's neutral and bureaucratic, and it was created by the UN. In fact, it's an organization that ostensibly acts in the public interest, but which has been deeply compromised in its funding model by private interests. And in terms of Gates, someone whose organizations have been promoting, the globalist agenda, who were, played a crucial role in rolling out the COVID-19 public narrative, and who ultimately represent the interests of big pharma.
And then just let's get back to the basics. Why should we be granting this level of power and authority over everything under the sun, everything that Canadians now consider their life, their lifestyle, their rights, their jurisdictional avenues, their constitution, their charter, everything in one means to protect ourselves against the possibility, the maybe could risk of a pandemic? Why? Why are we doing this? This is absurd, and we must stand for reason. This is absurd. It's so broad. It's such an excessive grant of power, and I think you and I have really, if we miss something, um, maybe we missed something, but we really, you and I dissected the possible horror within this act.
Yes, it is. It is the most overreaching piece of legislation that I have ever seen in this country.
Well, I'm glad you agreed to discuss this with me, Michael. I think we've worked really well on pointing out what we're worried about, and I'm going to share our video with members of Parliament, with members of the Senate, and I'm going to ask you to share it as well with whoever you have in your field. We have 2 weeks to raise some awareness about a very a very difficult bill that shouldn't pass. What remedies would you say are afforded to us now should this pass?
That's a very good question, because they would all be, theoretical until some action is actually taken.
But the problem is when action is taken, it's going to come with, an emergency declaration, and then the ability to squirrel over to court, is it going to be there?
Right. Well, I would say, if there were somebody motivated, at the provincial level, and that's a big problem to begin with, I suppose you could bring the act to the Supreme Court to ask it to rule on jurisdictional issues, whether the federal government is intruding upon provincial authority. So that might be one way to kind of roll this thing back, is to put a constitutional question before the court. But that requires a motivated political actor, and we don't really have a government or like that. That's, perhaps Alberta, but I'm not sure they would go to the trouble. But we
Or
just don't.
Scott Moe, this has a lot of intrusions on his base. It's an agricultural community that he has. It's talking about, going after the ag industry, and it's going to change everything in society. And one of the things that dawns on me is, and this is with more of the smart city and infrastructure, is, are we setting up a mechanism that we're punishing Canadians without due process, that we're setting up a massive, maybe this is some kind of class action, that this is causing us stress, that we know that this has the means to expropriate us, change our food, change our diet, change our GDP, change our communities. Is there
Well, to
class
get a class
action there?
action qualified, you would need some sort of concrete harm. So it would have to materialize. I'm not sure you could get a class action. I mean, I could be wrong. I'm not sure you can get a class action simply for a declaration that something is potentially harmful or potentially an infringement of your charter rights, for example.
The interesting thing is that you lose, but raise awareness of something that's extremely dangerous moving in our society, right? It like at some point, um, the thing I see about the globalists is that they were prepared to lose again and again until they won, and they slowly set up the bureaucratic state across Canada by being okay with losing until they won, and they just kept getting back on the horse until they devoured our nation. And this is the big bite. This is swallowing it. Let's stay in touch on this. Any parting words to everybody?
Just anybody who watches this, please share it with as many people as you can because we need to build awareness and we need to get on board with your campaign of writing to our senators to make them aware of how dangerous this bill is and ask them to vote against it.
Yeah, the court of public opinion.
Yep.
Let's try to win there. Bye, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Okay. Let's see if I can stop recording. I don't know.